Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Shah Jahan, Professor, School of Social Work, Tata Institute of Social Sciences. In this module, we are discussing further on the ideas of conflicts which we discussed in earlier module while introducing the conflict. This is the second module in this section on conflicts and social work. So in this particular module, what we are trying to look at is processes and understanding which will help us analyzing conflicts. So we are going to, this conflict is titled Conflicts and Conflict Analysis. Essentially from this module, what we are going to look at is what are those nature of a system that reproduces incompatibility among various entities within the society, which leads to conflict. So we need to understand what are the systems which recreates conflict within the society. We'll also examine various sources of discontent which emanates from various factors of inequality, incompatibility of goals and things like that, which could lead to conflict. And what are those relationships within the society? How do we analyze these relationships to understand the conflicts better? These understandings which help us illuminate us to evolve strategies of dealing with conflicts. So this module on conflict analysis is essentially trying to look at how to look at conflicts so that we can evolve strategies of dealing with conflicts in a much more detailed way. So why do we do conflict analysis? Conflict analysis helps thinking about how programs are going to work in conflict-affected contexts. We are talking about social work engagement in conflict-affected situations. So it is very, very important that you analyze conflict, identify different interactions between different parties, and what are the different root causes of conflict, which are factors which contribute to conflict. So a process of participatory conflict analysis will help us to get to the roots of the conflict and thereby trying to understand the various dynamics of conflict which exist in the society. So this understanding will help us to adopt conflict-sensitive practice while working with communities, while working with different groups and in various kind of contexts. Now, when we are trying to do this conflict analysis help us to understand the positions, interests and needs. I discussed about in the previous module, I was talking about different positions. That positions are something which is outwardly seen. Probably below that position there are shared interests, are diverging interests as well. Then further you will have the needs, which are the basic which people must achieve. So this process of analysis will help us in understanding the indicators of conflicts. Those indicators will help us ideas about how to engage with those. So methods of intervention in a society where conflicts are happening, the methods of intervention is to be associated with the very nature of the causes and the dynamics operating within that kind of a conflict context. So conflict analysis is all about trying to understand the conflict and the dynamics which is operating, which will inform our practice within conflict kind of a context. Now, if you look at the picture, it talks about the dynamics which exist across the context of the conflict, the causes of the conflict and the actors. Let us look at these three different factors, three different components within the conflict. There is a context, and that context and the actors and the causes, these continuously interact each other. That interaction is something which leads to a kind of a conflict. Let us look at what is the profile. The profile essentially means when we are analyzing conflict, we are trying to analyze the profile of conflict. What do we mean by profile? It talks about the political, economic and social cultural context in which the conflict is emerging. So when we talk about caste conflict, we are trying to talk about historical oppression of certain sections of the society. When we talk about Maoism, we are also talking about the lack of access to resources and things like that, and then other kind of political dimensions which came over a period of time. So there is political, economic, social, cultural factors which are creating the basis for the conflict. So then there is also a history of the conflict. The conflict is, it's not like conflict is happening, two communities are fighting, two groups are fighting. There is a historical background to it. That historicity of the conflict is also extremely important. How did it emanate? What are the kind of grievances? Look at Tamil and Sinhalese conflict in Sri Lanka. There is a history of people probably of a different language, different identity, different ethnicity being present in Sri Lanka, during the colonial time, since the colonial time onwards. So these identities became hardened identities, and thereby some of the identities, like the Tamilians, their identities were considered as, or they were considered as others within the society, including the language issue, which language became a significant factor in firming up the differences and things like that. So there is a history. We need to understand the history of the conflict. In conflict analysis, we will look at this history of the conflict as well. Then let's look at the causes. What are the causes? We talked about in our previous module about the structural roots of conflict. There could be structural factors, inequities, income inequities, there could be status inequities, there could be livelihood inequalities, there is all kind of social, cultural inequalities which exist. There could be those structures which are creating problem. There could be proximate causes. There could be something like an incident which happened, which triggered. When we look at this Kashmir conflict, we always have, since mid-80s onwards, when the conflict started happening, there is a situation of conflict escalating and then again de-escalating, maybe a small incident of a firing which could lead to a large scale conflict. There could be a proximate cause. There could be an immediate trigger as well. So we need to understand what are those causative factors which contribute to the conflict. So these factors also help us to continue if those factors are not addressed properly. Then we need to look at the actors. Which are the actors? Is it the two conflicting parties? Say for example, if you look at the various riots which happens in the country, is it between Hindus, Muslims? Are these the only actors? Not really. There are multiple actors. There could be the police, there could be the state system, there could be other kind of political groups trying to make mileage out of the conflict and things like that. There are multiple actors which exist who are having different interests, goals, positions and capacities. These actors make the conflict continue. And the dynamics is about what kind of transaction happens across these three different components of the conflict. Now, briefly I mentioned about this in my previous module as well, about the different positions. There are positions which are, we pronounce positions which are visible, which are obviously seen. But those positions are something which go, probably Naga movement. If you take the Naga movement, Nagas want separate Naga identity, Naga limb, and Indian state wanted, as a unified state. So are these the positions? But these are definitely positions, but at the same time, below that there is a question of cultural identity. There is a question of unfulfilled needs. So we need to go down. The conflict analysis will help us to go down and down into this kind of analysis. So what positions, when we say positions are what we say we want. We say that we want greater Naga. So that's a position we are taking. At the same time, there are certain interests. What is the interest? Interest is cultural specificity and cultural sensitive approaches. That's what really want. And then of course development. Needs are something which everybody must have. So we categorize, when we are analyzing conflict, we look at the positions, the interests and the needs. So these needs to be segregated. Needs can be, probably we can address the needs. We cannot address the positions straight away. We need to address the needs, and then whether that addressing the needs cater to the interests of the people, and thereby the positions can be changed over a period of time. So we could do this kind of an exercise, by taking any kind of examples, by doing a kind of a position, interest, and needs analysis. Now, this layer analysis of different layers of positions, interests, needs will help us to understand what makes the conflict continue. If there are unmet needs, there might be violence happening. You might be using force to control violence, but at the same time there are unmet needs. If those unmet needs are not fulfilled, this violence probably can be controlled by using force or using other means, but at the same time the needs are not met, so it will evolve after a point in time. It again erupts as violence. So in this process we will be able to identify if there are shared interests and shared needs which both the parties in opposition to each other having, like the case of development needs, employment, livelihoods. So these are shared needs between any different communities, be it the Hindu-Muslim conflict which exists. There are shared interests of jobs, of livelihoods, and very healthcare and everything. These are shared interests. People belonging to poor sections of the society have these shared interests. So maybe if we go down positions, we will identify these shared interests and needs, which will help us to work effectively on the conflict. While moving from the conflict layers analysis of positions, interests, and needs, in order to get a little more nuanced understanding of conflict, what we could do is there is something called a conflict tree analysis. What we are doing in conflict tree analysis is that what are the things which we obviously see in a conflict? So for example, in a conflict-ridden society, you will find that there is human rights violations happening. There is poverty, extreme poverty happening. Take any conflict-ridden society, you will find these kind of issues. You will also see a lot of use and abuse of drugs and addictions which are there. You will also find that malnutritions, there are a lot of issues which is outwardly seen in a conflict society. So what you are seeing is the canopy of the conflict. You could obviously see those kind of issues out there. But these are manifestations. I would say these are manifestations of a deep-rooted conflict which exists in the society. So how do we get into the roots of it? What we can do is that in a participatory exercise, if you draw a tree and try to tell the participants that identify what do you see in a conflict society. You will see various things, as I mentioned, about human rights violations, killing, probably rapes, or people living in poverty, people not having livelihoods, people living because of malnutrition, dying because of malnutrition, drugs trafficking is happening. So these are things which people would probably actually say that this is what is happening in the society. On going down, if you ask them what are the situations which creates a situation where these manifestations are existing, they say that the governance is very bad, the government or the governance structures are very weak, or the politicians are using their own powers in usurping resources to certain sections and things like that. So there are certain factors which keep this trouble going. Why poverty in certain regions of the country? So there are corruptions happening. There are a lot of middlemen. In the case of agriculture kind of a crisis, you could see that there are a lot of middlemen operating. This middleman provides credits to the people, and this, after taking credits, they have to give their producers back to the middlemen, and thereby there is a continuous exploitation happening. So these are people who actually, these are actors, these are institutions, structures which sustain the conflict, which leads to poverty, which leads to malnutrition, which leads to various other forms of expression of the conflict. So this conflict tree analysis will help us. What sustains conflict? So that forms the trunk of the tree. So what you've seen is the manifestations, then you come to the trunk of the tree. Now, this is the trunk. What are the root causes? you will identify that there are systems which exist in the society which could be the caste-based discrimination, which could be absolute lack of governance structures or law and order problem which exists in the society. Quite often, some of these Bimaru states have been talked about as poorly governed states. So these are states which are a large number of people are living in poverty. So these are also states which are known to be less governed or not properly governed. The governance structures are weak. So you will identify that these governance structures, weak governance structures, weak probably conflictual caste relations, all these things are the root cause, which are sustained by institutions or politicians or corruption and things like that, and that get manifested in the form of various dimensions of outward manifestation of conflicts, which we talked about. So the idea of this conflict tree analysis is to see what do you see obviously, what do you think are the factors which sustain a conflict, and what do you think are the root causes of conflict. So once you get to the root cause of the conflict, any action plan can be developed. I'm not saying that there could be a foolproof mechanism, but at the same time, you can identify where do you prioritize your interventions. How do you prioritize your intervention? How do you engage with societies in understanding, not only dealing with malnutrition, you cannot deal with malnutrition by providing nutrient supplements. You need to look at why do people have malnutrition, why do people live in hunger. So those kind of root causes can be analyzed using conflict. So this conflict tree analysis helps us to stimulate discussions, to identify causes, for a group which is involved in conflict to evolve an understanding as to how to deal with this conflict in a much more nuanced way. So how does this help in intervention? It will assist the group or a team to make decisions about priorities. You look at, okay, these are root causes or these are non-negotiable issues, one can address that. So this will help us to decide what kind of issues need immediate attention, what kind of issues need long-term interventions, what kind of engagements needs to be there with different actors. From the positions, needs and interest analysis, let us look at this iceberg framework to understand conflicts. Let us look at an issue of terrorist attack. What we are seeing is bombing, and we are seeing an attack. The other day we had an attack in London. The bus rammed into some sections of the people coming from the mosque. So these are what we are seeing as an outward manifestation of the conflict. This will, if you are trying to control this, we are not actually addressing the conflict in a positive way. The reason is that we see the outward manifestation and that as a conflict. If you go deeper into that, we will be able to see that there are proximate causes. So something people have been talking about in various media about the attack which happened in London a few days recently, is that there is a sense of Islamophobia which is generated within the society. So that's a proximate cause. Could be that the refugee influx from other parts of the country, and there are other political formations talking about certain sections of the society as a problem for the country and things like that. So these are proximate causes which has triggered an action that I will kill all Muslims. That was what the person who rammed the truck into a set of people in the city of London talked about. The underlying drivers could be this huge schism which exists within the society between different identity groups. And those are, when you go further down, like in the case of caste atrocities, you will find that there are deep historical grievances which exist in the society. What are those deep historical grievances? It could be denying their rightful share of development. It could be denying their dignity. I could give you an example when somebody was mentioning about a situation where people were standing in a queue in an airport and when then for checking in at the airport counter, and before reaching, in one line was not moving while all other lines were moving. So somebody from the counter shouted and saying that, "Aap Kota se aaya hai kya? Have you come from Kota?" The person shouting was thinking that the person sitting at the counter is coming from Kota reservation, and thereby he or she doesn't know how to do work. That's why this line is not moving. That was a kind of attitude which the person has kept in mind while explaining or finding explanation for the situation there. When it was inquired why this line was not moving, if the printer malfunctioned. But the person, by seeing the person at the counter, assumed that the person is coming from a particular quota or from reservation, mentioning about the Dalits, and thereby the person is not able to do the job properly. So these kind of historical grievances, historical roots, historical stereotypes about identities are creating. So the moment these kind of situation happens in a society, it leads to oppression. It leads to various kind of grievances within the society. These are deep rooted. Quite often these things doesn't come out in the open. What we see is that a Dalit murder, killed, or there is a rape happened in a village and things like that. But these are outward expressions. There are deep rooted historical factors of oppression and subjugation which happens in the society. So this way of, if you try to take an example of a conflict and try to look at what do you see. Generally, obviously, what are the things seen? What are the proximate causes? What are the historical, deep-rooted historical factors which leads to this conflict? You will be able to understand as to what are the factors which sustains a conflict over a period of time. So these different tools which help us to understand conflicts and go deeper and deeper into understanding and analyzing conflicts and identifying the various interactions which happens, various dynamics which operates. Similarly, another framework which could help us in understanding conflict much better is called actor mapping analysis. When we are saying actor mapping analysis, we could identify different actors, different stakeholders in a conflict. It could be different ethnic groups. There could be two ethnic groups fighting each other, the Nagas and Kukis in the Northeast. So they could be, these two identity groups could be the prominent actors. But there are other actors as well. These could be identity groups or people belonging to certain ethnic groups, but there are other formations. There are other political parties. There are other cultural groups. There are different groups are playing significantly into the conflict. So you identify these different actors, map it map it properly in terms of understanding the relationship between different actors. There could be multiple interactions which are happening. Those interactions can be mapped, and to see how these interactions, how these actors are contributing to the conflict. So this actor mapping analysis will help us to graphically represent the conflict. The conflict is when we try to draw the relationship between different actors, we will understand the complexity of interactions, complexity of the conflict which exists out there in the ground. So this actor mapping analysis also help us to place the parties in relation to the problem and with each other. So you have a problem, you have an issue. That issue can be looked at from each actor's point of view. How this particular actor is behaving in a particular way, what are the grievances they have, what are the needs they have, what are the aspirations they have. We could expand it to as much minute details as possible to understand and analyze conflict. So how does this help? Actor mapping help us in intervention in conflicts. We will be able to understand, when we are clear about the interaction between different actors, we will be able to see, okay, how this hateful interactions can be converted, or what are the factors which creates hateful interactions or violent interactions. So you can identify strategies, you can look for openings for engagement in those kind of situations. If you look at these as fight between two parties, then we will not be able to go down into in terms of understanding what could be the actions which we could take. So we will also look at the which are the allies. Say for example, in Naga conflict, when I study Naga conflict, there are a lot of human rights groups, there are a lot of women's groups. Naga Mothers Association is a very, very powerful group in that region where Naga conflict exists. So Naga Mothers Association played a significant role in brokering peace or demanding for peace. So there we could identify who are the allies in the actor. Actors are not only interacting and contributing to the conflict, there could be actors which are also working towards building peace. So we can identify who are the allies who could actually be useful for working on conflicts and bringing back peace to in the society. So this actor mapping analysis, if you do on a periodical basis in a participatory mode, we can also look at how over a period of time the conflictual relations have changed probably through an intervention. You probably will be doing a development intervention in a conflict affected areas. So after doing a intervention, you will be able to evaluate whether these conflictual relationship has eased, or that has the violent interactions have eased. So you will be able to evaluate your own program, how this has contributed to development and peace building. Another important framework which could help us in analyzing conflict is called timeline analysis. I talked about historical factors while discussing about the interaction between the context, actors and causes. The historicity of a conflict is an extremely important aspect. If you could map what are the things happened at different points in time in the history of the conflict, you will identify that, okay, this particular event happened in a particular period, and what are the political dimensions of that particular event happened, what are the things happened generally in the society at that particular point in time. So you look at the timeline of events on one side and what has been the larger political, social, cultural process which happened in that society. So you could look at the timeline and link it to processes, social process which happen, and this timeline analysis will show different views of history in the conflict. People could actually look at, okay, this particular event happened because of this. So the history of the conflict can be analyzed in a much more nuanced way if you have a timeline clearly drawn and looking at how different actors look at these conflicts and events happen at different points in time. Thereby, if there is a possibility that, say for example, in Orissa, there was an incident of conflict between the tribals and the Christian community and things like that. So in that conflict, it has been seen that every time when the Christmas celebration, during the Christmas time, the conflict becomes pronounced. So the Christmas time become the Christians, probably converted Christians, they celebrate Christmas, and at that time the other tribal communities who are not belong to the Christian tradition, they would also organize similar programs. So this became a period when repeated incidents of violence and conflict used to happen. So one could understand that, okay, this is in the timeline, in an annual calendar of events, an annual turn of events happening. You could see that this is a particular time when the conflicts are at the peak. So you could actually plan for engagement with societies, engagement with different communities during much before this this time, so that you can engage with communities much more effectively and thereby reduce the incidence of conflicts. So in this process, we will be able to understand what can be much more useful in reducing conflict. What are the engagements which one could use in reducing conflict? How different parties and can engage with conflicts and looking at the turn of events happening at different points in time in the history. So, in order to conclude this session on conflict, what we are trying to look at by this module is we are introducing various frameworks. We have introduced various frameworks to understand and analyze conflicts. So these frameworks will help us to understand the nature of system that produces and reproduces incompatibility among different social and political units. By analyzing conflict using different frameworks, we will also be able to identify different factors leading to origin, escalation, sustenance, and de-escalation of conflicts. When we are saying this entire process of origin, escalation, sustenance, and de-escalation, that's exactly the cycle in which the conflict happens. So by using actor mapping analysis, by using timeline analysis, by using iceberg, by using various other kind of frameworks which we have discussed, we will be able to identify conflicts, positions, interests, and needs of the conflicting parties. The indicators of conflict can be very clearly identified. Various actors and their various adversarial parties which contributes to conflict and their contribution to the conflict and their contribution to peace building can also be identified. So this way of analyzing creates a knowledge base, an expertise base among people who would like to work in conflict situations to understand conflicts much more nuanced way, thereby developing programs or developing engagement plans with communities affected by conflicts. I would suggest that you could use any of these frameworks. Take any example. As an exercise, I would suggest that take any example of a conflict, use it with different frameworks, and then you will understand how better we understand the conflict by doing this kind of an exercise, thereby the ability for us to plan development programs and interventions much more effectively. There are readings, there is texts which are given in the module, there are readings which are given, and along with these exercises will give a better understanding of conflict. Thank you so much.